A while ago, I bought an entire plum tree with an incredible grain and color. I've already used the main trunk and the thicker branches in other projects, but I had no idea what to do with the thinner ones. It felt like a waste to just throw them in the fire. So I started thinking about how I could make use of them, and I came up with an idea that might turn out pretty cool. For those of you who have logs that are too thin to make something out of but don't want to get rid of them, check out this video. It might give you some ideas on what to do with them. For years, my wife has been asking me to make her something, but I still haven't dared to do it. No, don't get any funny ideas. I'm talking about a piece of furniture. She wants a piece of furniture to put her record player on. I think she totally deserves it. Putting up with my nonsense for so many years can't be easy. That deserves a reward. I've decided to take it a step further. Instead of just making a piece of furniture to hold the record player, I'm going to build it with the record player directly embedded in it. I think I might be getting myself into something way too complicated, but hey, otherwise it'd be boring. Gotta keep things challenging. For the first piece, I'm gonna split this log in half. I'll be using the bandsaw for that, so to keep it relatively safe, I need to secure it to a flat base. If you're cutting pieces with a good support surface, the bandsaw is a pretty safe tool. The problems start when you try to cut pieces that don't have a stable base. That's when it can become a serious hazard. But one thing you should never do is try to cut a round log into slices with a bandsaw. There's a high chance of an accident. The blade could snap, the wood could get thrown straight at your face, or worse, it could pull your hand right into the blade. I'm going to use a technique I came up with, and I haven't seen anyone else do it before. So I'm a bit unsure about it. Right now, I'm at a point where I don't even know if I'll be able to finish this piece. At least not the way I have it in mind. The idea is to cut some slabs for the sidewalls, but leave a section uncut at the end to create a curve that flows into the countertop. I hope you can picture what I'm going for. First, I'm going to cut the pieces for the left side wall. I think once you see it, it'll be easier to understand what I'm trying to do. There's a little problem with not cutting all the way through. It's not easy to back out since the blade gets stuck. I had to get a bit creative to work around it. I don't want the blade to come off track and have to reset it. It takes a while to get it properly adjusted again so the saw runs smoothly. I want the final thickness of all the parts to be around 3 centimeters. So at the top, I'll leave a section about 7 centimeters thick to have enough material to shape the curve. Here you can see exactly what I'm trying to do. Sometimes I take too many risks, like here. I almost ruined the entire piece just to save 30 seconds of cutting with a handsaw. In woodworking, it's really important to decide whether taking a faster approach to save time will actually end up making you spend 10 times longer than if you had just gone with a safer method. Then again, this applies to a lot of things, not just woodworking. Like when you decide you can carry all the grocery bags from the car in one trip, but halfway there, one slips, everything spills, and you end up spending half an hour cleaning chocolate milk off your entryway floor. No, it's not like that ever happened to me. And I definitely wasn't the idiot who had to waste another hour going back to the store to buy his daughter her damn chocolate milk. Anyway, I've cut all the pieces I need for one of the sidewalls. Now let's move on to the other one, which is going to be a bit trickier since it needs a curve at the top and another one at the bottom. But where I'm really going to have trouble with this piece is when it comes to flattening it. Not only does it not have a flat base, but it also has those sticking out parts at the beginning and the end. I need to start thinking about how I'm going to handle this because I have to make 3 pieces like this. Like most fruit trees, this plum tree has really hard wood, so I have to take it slow and avoid putting too much pressure if I don't want to break the bandsaw blade. So far, things are going pretty well. I managed to cut the first piece without too much trouble. Now I just need 2 more like this one. The next part I need to take care of is the small curve that rises on the bottom right. I thought about adding this section as a spot to place the vinyl sleeve while we're listening to it. So far, this is the simplest piece. For now, splitting a log in half is enough. The only thing I need to do is be careful not to cut off a finger. The other day I was talking to a friend and he told me that if you cut off a finger, it doesn't grow back. I couldn't believe it. Ever since I found that out, I've been way more careful when working with power tools. To make the cross shelf where the vinyl records will go, I'm going to try cutting a few small slabs from the logs and join them the traditional way to get a board the size I need. I'll try to get the pieces as even as possible, but these boards are still going to be pretty cracked. I'll have to deal with that later. That's what happens when you let a log dry without cutting it into boards first. Cracks are pretty much inevitable. The only way to prevent this would have been to seal both end grain sides with wax or some kind of sealer while the log was still fresh. This makes the moisture evaporate through the sides instead of the ends, so it dries more slowly and helps prevent the wood from cracking. Well, all that's left now is the top, and for that, I'm going to use the slices I cut earlier. Even though this wood is pretty dry, it still has a bit more moisture than I like to work with. So I'm going to put it in the kiln for a few days to let it dry out completely. I have a small kiln that I built myself, and it works perfectly for drying pieces of wood that aren't too big like these. I like working with wood as dry as possible, always below 10% moisture, and if possible, even under 8%. I've got one of those Wagner pinless moisture meters that measure the moisture inside the wood, which is what really matters. The surface dries faster and can give you a misleading reading. I know it would take less time if I just removed all the bark at once before slicing the wood, but I once heard that wood cracks less if you let it dry with the bark on. Honestly, I don't think it makes any difference at all, but it's one of those habits you just get used to. Even when you know it's pointless, you keep doing it anyway, like pressing the elevator button multiple times to make it come faster or looking both ways before crossing a street. Well, either way, it's not too much trouble to remove the bark piece by piece. Once it's dry, it peels off the wood much more easily, so I'm just going to keep doing it my way. Now comes one of the tricky parts. I need to flatten one side of these pieces, and it won't be easy with these sections on the ends. Running them through the planer is obviously not an option, so I'll have to do it in a few steps. First, I'll flatten as much as I can with the router sled. That way, at least part of the surface will be at the height I want, and from there, I can level out the rest. There's still a pretty big section left to flatten. I'll have to use a different method. On the other end, I couldn't reach all the way either because that part was hanging off the workbench. This side should be easier though. I just need to keep going with the router and this jig until I reach the end. It's one of those super simple tricks that can save us a ton of time and effort. However, on this side, I'll be able to remove a bit more material with the router, but I still won't reach the very end. For that last section, there's no other option but to do it by hand. I'll use a hand plane even though it's not ideal since I have to go against the grain. I have to admit the hand plane is one of my least favorite tools. Yeah, I know, it's one of the most iconic and representative tools in woodworking, but I just can't seem to get the hang of it. To be fair, I haven't used it much, and I've never really had the chance to learn how to use it properly, so maybe that's the real issue. I know saying this might cost me a few followers among the more traditional woodworkers, but hey, we all have our weak spots, and I think it's good to acknowledge them. I've been thinking about what I'd say if someone asked me what my favorite tools are. I think at the top of the list for power tools would be the bandsaw, closely followed by the orbital sander. As for hand tools, the chisel would definitely take first place. I also really like the Japanese saw. At the bottom of the list, I'd probably put the hand plane and the jigsaw. I know the jigsaw is a practical tool, but I don't know. It just feels too imprecise to me. Now that I've finally flattened these three pieces, the next step is to cut the edges straight so I can join them together. As always, I'll set the piece on a flat base to cut it with the bandsaw so I can run it through the jointer afterward. See that little bandage on my finger? I got that a couple of days ago. Nothing serious, but definitely not pleasant. I get splinters all the time. Any woodworker knows what I'm talking about. I think it happens to me even more than usual because I don't really like wearing gloves and forget to put them on most of the time. Well, this time, something happened that had never happened to me before. I got a splinter in such a way that it went in through my knuckle, parallel to the bone, and almost reached the next knuckle. It was like a long, thin needle. It had gone in more than an inch. I couldn't bring myself to pull it out. I had to take a deep breath, close my eyes, and yank it out. Once I get a relatively flat surface on all edges with the bandsaw, I have to get the pieces through the jointer so I can glue them together. For that, I need at least one flat face perpendicular to the one I have to flatten. Otherwise, it'll be impossible to get the edges to 90 degrees for gluing. I'm going to make a setup similar to the one I built for the bandsaw, so I can run the pieces through the jointer safely. The jointer is a tool we really need to respect. It can give us the false impression of being safe, since the blades barely stick out. But if not used with basic safety rules, it can be extremely dangerous. The problem with the jointer is the outcome of a potential accident. If we have an accident with something like the table saw, We might lose a finger, and if we're lucky, they could stitch it back on. But if our hand accidentally goes into the jointer blades, all you'll get is a bunch of meat for burgers, and you'll never tie your shoelaces again. Now that I've managed to flatten one of the edges and make it perpendicular to the main faces, I need to flatten the other edge. But we have to make it parallel to the one we already flattened so we can join all the pieces together and get a flat board. For that, we need to use the planer. This tool basically gives us a flat surface that's parallel to the base. That's why the jointer and the planer are two tools that usually need to be combined to make large boards by joining smaller pieces together. I'm going to smooth out these sharp edges so the finished piece has a uniform look. Everything will be organic shapes and curves, and if I leave these straight lines, they'll mess up the effect I'm going for. This is taking me quite a bit of time and effort, and it would be a shame if a small detail like this messed up the final result. Or maybe it's one of those things that absolutely no one would notice, and I'd be the only one bothered by knowing that tiny flaw is there. And even if that were the case, I'd still fix it. I wouldn't sleep well knowing it was there. I might be a little obsessive about these details, but hey, it doesn't hurt anyone. The only one it really causes trouble for is me, since sometimes I've spent hours fixing little things that I know absolutely no one would ever notice. Well, I've got the first sidewall done. Now I'm going to make the other one pretty much the same way. This one's easier since one of the faces is completely flat, so I'm going to speed through the process. Remember at the beginning of the video when I put the wood in the kiln for a few days, even though it was already pretty dry? Well, now you're going to see why it was worth it. Inside this board, there was a little friend that no one invited, and he was busy eating the wood. If I hadn't put it in the kiln, he'd still be alive right now. And he's not exactly the kind of guest you'd want in your furniture at home. Luckily, a few days at high temperatures took care of that. Him and any of his brothers. I need to make a piece to hold the turntable mechanism, and I've decided that 3D printing is the best way to go. I tried using a friend's home printer, but the result was terrible, so I'm leaving it to the professionals. JLC 3DP is a service that provides on-demand 3D printing for manufacturing solutions. All I have to do is design the piece I need, and they'll take care of the rest. The streamlined online platform allows for easy upload of 3D models, instant quotes, and real-time order tracking. From material selection to the speedy delivery of final products, they meticulously manage every step, from order to delivery within just 7 days. I've already received the package. Let's see how the piece looks. It's true that this is a collaboration, but I have to honestly say that I'm really impressed with the quality of the piece. I wasn't expecting such a professional result. The piece is sanded and finished perfectly. And all of that at a really low price. JLC 3DP printing starts at $0.3 up to $60 new user coupons. Check out what they can do for you at the link below. Well, we all make mistakes every now and then, that's for sure. But I feel like I make way too many. And what frustrates me the most is when I realize something is wrong, but have no idea when or where I messed up. Like here. I measured and added up the boards to make sure both pieces were the same width. But now, like magic, one is bigger than the other. Sometimes, I think someone sneaks in at night and changes things just to mess with me. It's not something that'll take me too long to fix, but it's at least an hour or two of work I wasn't expecting. This isn't a commission, so I don't worry too much about time. But when you're making a piece for a client, it's a different story. Besides the materials, I have to set a price based on how many hours it'll take to finish. And if you make too many mistakes like this, it can completely throw off the budget and make the whole project unprofitable. And obviously that's on me. If I told the client, for example, that it's going to take me 50 hours of work and that comes out to $2,000, I can't just go back later and say, hey, turns out it actually took me 60 hours because I'm an idiot. So the price is now $2,500. The client would tell me to get lost, and they'd be absolutely right. Honestly, in this work, one of the toughest things is giving a price when someone asks for a quote on a custom piece. If you're making things that are similar and what they're asking for is something you've done 100 times, no problem. You're confident about how long it'll take. The issue is that I often do pretty unique projects, and it's not easy to get the work time right. In woodworking, there are some processes that take a lot of time, and one mistake or a process you didn't think of can easily cost you an entire day of work, which adds up to a decent chunk of money. Let's say to make the numbers work, I charge $50 an hour for my work. A mistake that takes 10 hours to fix adds an extra $500 you'd have to add to the price of the project. For a piece that's, for example, $3,000, that's a pretty big percentage. I just built the cross shelf where the vinyls will rest. Next, I'm going to flatten the inner faces of the side walls and give them their final thickness and length. As you can see, this wood has a ton of cracks and imperfections that I need to fill somehow. I'm going to use epoxy putty. I won't use the typical wood filler. I really don't like it, especially for big cracks like this. It's not very scratch resistant, and since it doesn't have good adhesion and isn't flexible, it can't handle the small movements in the wood and cracks. On the other hand, this epoxy-based putty is super durable, sticks well to the wood, and since it's a bit flexible, it doesn't crack. That said, it's a little more expensive than regular wood filler. This 2-component putty is usually used for boat repairs. I couldn't find any brand that sells it in black, so I added the pigment I use to tint epoxy resin. I've tried it before, and it doesn't affect the drying at all. The top part of the walls is going to be part of the tabletop, so I need to flatten it and make sure it's perfectly perpendicular to the side. If I had a slightly bigger one, I could do it with just the track saw, but this one can only cut up to 55 millimeters deep, so I'll have to figure out another way to cut the remaining part. Festool has a model that cuts up to 75 millimeters, but honestly, it's not something I need very often, and for just 20 extra millimeters, I don't think it's worth it. If I ever get a bigger one, I'll go for something that can really cut deep. I think Makita has a circular saw that cuts over 150 millimeters deep. One of those would be awesome. Next, I need to take care of the curve I'm going to shape at the bottom of one of the walls. First, I'll make a long piece by joining all these chunks together, and then I'll have to carve it with the angle grinder. I'm always trying to improve my videos, and the best way to do that is by listening to what my viewers think. So, in my last video, I asked if you could leave a comment telling me why you subscribed to my channel to help me get better. The video started getting way more comments than usual, and I was happily thinking, wow, I have an amazing community that really supports me and wants to help. But then I started going through the comments and realized that half of them were complaints about the voiceover only playing on one side. Yep, that's me. I uploaded a video that took me countless hours to make, with the voice in mono instead of stereo. And for those of you listening with headphones, that's pretty annoying. And the best part? There's no way to fix it. I'd have to delete the video and re-upload it, which would be a disaster for views. Like I've said before, I make a ton of mistakes, and this one's a solid example. So this time, I've got another question for you. No, it's not whether you prefer videos in mono or stereo. I'm guessing the only people who'd vote for mono are those who can only hear in one ear, and I don't think that's a huge demographic. What I'd like to know is, do you prefer that I keep building tables like in most of my videos? Or would you like to see me make other kinds of pieces, like the one I'm working on today? To shape the curve the way I want, the only thing I can think of that might work is using the angle grinder with carving discs. I have to be really careful and take it slow because if it slips, I could end up with a deep mark in the wood that won't be easy to fix. The last pass was done with a fine grit disc, which removes very little material and allows for more precise work. I need to make the same curve on the smaller piece. Before the curve starts, there's a flat section that would be impossible to get with the carving discs, so before I start using them, I'm going to run the piece through the table saw to get that straight edge. This piece doesn't have a flat top surface that would let me run it through the table saw to remove that extra corner of material, so I'm going to do it in a way that's a little less elegant, but just as effective. I could have taken it off directly with the angle grinder, but there's a risk of damaging the flat surface. Plus, the less material I have to remove with carving, the better. It kicks up a ton of dust that I'll have to clean up later. It's looking pretty good so far, don't you think? But before I join the two pieces, I need to sand them properly and get rid of all the marks. Once they're glued together, sanding that narrow channel would be a real pain. I'm going to round off the corners at the end. Like I mentioned before, I want this piece to have an organic look with smooth flowing lines. So I'm getting rid of any sharp or straight edges. I'll use the same 3 centimeter radius as the curve I just made. The thickness of the walls is also 3 centimeters. I think using the same measurement throughout makes the final design feel more natural and visually consistent. I'm going to join the pieces with epoxy resin. I know a lot of people are against using epoxy in woodworking, and I get why some don't like those massive river tables that have more resin than wood. It's a matter of taste. But what I don't understand is being against using epoxy as just another tool in woodworking. It's a great solution for filling gaps and cracks or joining pieces with irregular edges like these. I actually think epoxy makes it possible to work with wood that would otherwise be unusable. Plus, it can save us a ton of time. Here, for example, I threw together a quick mold using a melamine base, some aluminum tape, and silicone. Since it's not a big pour, I can just use regular casting epoxy, and in 24 hours, it'll be cured and ready to keep working. When it comes to color, I'll admit, I'm a bit picky. I pretty much only like using black. I think it's the only color that actually works with wood. It doesn't steal the spotlight and gives it a sleek, elegant look. But hey, to each their own. Some people love those intense blues, greens, or even metallics that practically burn your retinas. All right, the next day I can keep going. The pieces are joined and they don't look too bad. Now I need to shape the curve on the top. It doesn't have to be perfect since it'll be covered by the 3D printed piece. As long as the edge looks good, that's all that matters. I'm also going to round off the corners on the lower part of the other wall. Time to make the top of the piece and put everything together. First, I'll position and clamp down the cross shelf and the piece that holds the turntable mechanism to get the exact distance the walls need to be apart. Once everything is more or less lined up and the angles match, I'm going to set it all on a melamine board covered with packing tape. I'll be using epoxy resin to join the slices that will make up the top, and the tape will keep it from sticking so it pops right off without any issues. I'm sticking it down with silicone to keep everything in place. I grab the slices I cut earlier and fit them together as best as I can. Obviously, I had already figured out the approximate width so that 2 slices would fit. All the slices are 3 centimeters tall so that I don't have to do any extra work once they're joined. Hopefully, a quick sanding will be enough. I want almost the entire surface to be wood, so I'm going to cut pieces to fit into the gaps. I could just leave it as is and fill the gaps with resin, but they're too big, and I think it'll look way better if I use wood instead. You can see that for cutting tighter curves, I use the bandsaw with a narrower blade. Wide blades work much better for cutting straight lines, but they don't let us turn to cut curves. I'm going to stick all the pieces to the melamine base with silicone to keep them from floating when I pour the resin. It's a common mistake when working with epoxy for the first time. You don't really think about the fact that wood floats and resin is liquid. Definitely something you don't want to forget. Now I just need to close off the sides with a couple of boards and seal everything up properly to prevent any leaks. I'm going to use the same fast-curing epoxy I used earlier. I'll pour it slowly, making sure it seeps into all the gaps so there aren't any air pockets. I don't really know why, but in videos where I use epoxy, there's always a spike in views right when I pour it, like a bunch of people come back just for that moment. Well, if that's what you like, here you go. Enjoy a few seconds of epoxy flowing over the wood. In 24 hours, we can take it off the base. The piece is finally starting to take shape. In this case, the silicone had 2 jobs: keeping the wood stuck to the base and preventing the epoxy from spreading all over the surface. Leaving some large areas without resin will make it much easier to sand everything down to the same level without having to flatten it. If there were a layer of epoxy covering the whole thing, I'd probably have to plane it down evenly by 1 or 2 millimeters. This way, running the belt sander over it is enough. I'm filling in the remaining gaps with putty now that the epoxy is dried. I know sanding the inside curve at the bottom is going to be tricky, but I haven't come up with a better solution. I'm going to sum it up in a few seconds for you, but getting it right took me way longer than I'm willing to admit. Honestly, this project is taking me way longer than I thought it would. Let's not talk about it. I need to fix this part and get it level with the rest of the edge. I think the easiest way is to use the track saw. If I try sanding it, not only will it take way too long, but it won't end up perfectly flat. Time to shape the outer curves, and they need to be perfect. I probably could have come up with some kind of jig for the router or something to make them perfectly exact and uniform, but that felt like way too much work. So I've decided to trust my steady hand and carve them directly with the angle grinder. Let's see if I end up regretting it later. First, I take off most of the material with a very coarse grit disc. For the final pass, I'll switch to a fine grit one. This part is pretty tricky. If the angle grinder slips and I take off too much wood, fixing it is going to be a real headache. So far, it's looking good. Finally, I'll even out the whole surface with the orbital sander. This was the part I was most worried about in the whole project, and I think it turned out pretty well. I'm gonna sleep great tonight. I'm a little worried about my wife's reaction when she sees it. She has a bit of a problem. She just can't hide it when she doesn't like something, no matter how hard she tries. Most people, when they get a gift that isn't exactly what they wanted, will fake it a little and say they love it. My wife tries, but she's so bad at lying that you can tell right away. After years of failed gifts, I'm used to it, but I have to admit it would sting if she didn't like this one. All right, I'm gonna round over all the edges with a 5mm bit. It's a slightly bigger radius than I usually go for, but I think it'll work best to highlight the rounded look I want for this piece. It's true that I don't think I'd be able to make a piece like this unless it was for a situation like this, a gift for someone. I don't think it's something that would sell easily, at least not for a price that would make it worth my time. And I doubt anyone would ask me to make a piece like this on commission. It's not exactly a common piece like a table or a kitchen countertop. By the way, I never mentioned this in my videos, but I do accept custom orders. So if you've got an idea in mind, you're looking for someone who can make it, and you like the way I work, feel free to reach out. I've got my website linked down below in the description. All right, I'm at that critical moment where there's a high chance I might ruin my wife's turntable. I've already checked that the same model is available on Amazon just in case. I could have a new one at my door in 2 days and no one would ever know. So far, I've managed to take it apart. Now, let's see if it actually works when I put it back together. I'm going to use the base where the mechanism sits. I'll cut it down and make an inlay in the top of my piece to fit it in. I think it's the most precise and easiest way to do it. I'll only cut the section that's completely covered by the turntable piece. I'll paint it black and I don't want anything visible except the beautiful plum wood I'm using for the whole build. The problem is I need to make an inlay with this shape as accurately as possible. It would be a perfect job for a CNC machine, but I don't have one. So once again, I'll have to rely on my steady hand. Not bad, right? I think if this YouTube thing doesn't work out, I could make a living as a portable CNC machine. Now I have to make a big hole in the center for the cables and all that. But I don't know, I feel a little uneasy doing it. It looks really good right now, and I'm scared I'll mess it up. But hey, I've got to stick to the plan, gotta trust the process. Well, at least after all the work, the piece fits perfectly. We're getting close to the end. One of the last steps is attaching the cross shelf. To do that, I'm going to have to get a little creative since I can't separate the sidewalls to join it with dowels. I could just use glue, and it would probably hold fine since it won't be carrying much weight. But at this point, let's do it right. No, I haven't lost my mind. I'm going to use screws to secure the shelf, and this is a little trick to hide them. We lift a small area of the surface with the chisel, and underneath, we make a hole big enough for the screw head to fit. Then, we just need to cover it all up again and glue it with wood glue. Another option would be to drill a rounded hole, insert the screw, and then cut a cylinder the size of the hole to cover it. But for it to blend in, you'd have to find a piece of wood the same color and match the grain. That method works well with woods that have more uniform tones and grain, but this one has a lot of different colors. We could use it here too, and if we do it right, almost no one will notice the circles. I've used it a few times on larger surfaces like tabletops, and unless someone told you where to look, it's almost impossible to spot the little circles. But yeah, it does take a bit more work since you have to find matching wood and cut the little cylinders. Personally, I prefer this method. Once the finish is applied, it's almost impossible to see. It's clear that every woodworker has their own preferences, and some things come more naturally to some than others. So it's really a matter of taste. But if you've never tried this method of hiding screws or dowels, give it a shot. It's worth it. Once you sand it, it almost disappears. Before applying the finish, I sand the entire piece thoroughly up to 180 grit. We're almost at the end, so if you've made it this far, it means you liked the video, or at least it didn't bother you too much. If that's the case, you might consider subscribing. It takes you a second and it helps me keep making videos like this. But if you don't feel like it, no worries, no hard feelings. I appreciate you watching either way. I'm applying a coat of hard wax oil, the finish I usually use on tabletops. Technology moves fast, and woodworking is no exception. Lately, some wood finishes made with nanocomponents have popped up, and they're supposed to offer great protection against moisture and scratches. This technology was already being used in the automotive industry. I haven't tested them yet to see if they're as good as they claim, but this time, I'll have the chance to find out. My friend Cam from Blacktail Studio sent me his N3 finish to try out. This isn't a collaboration or anything like that. He just asked me to share my thoughts, so let's see. Okay, to be honest, I said Cam is my friend to sound cooler, but we've only talked a couple of times. Either way, he seems like a nice guy. In case you haven't heard of him, I'll leave the link to his channel down below. You know, I like to help out small channels like his whenever I can. I can't say yet how scratch resistant this thing is. I'd have to wait a few months for that. But one thing's for sure, it looks impressive. It really makes the color of the wood pop. You can see it yourself. I like it. Lastly, I have to assemble the turntable. I'm going to cover the piece with black fabric to protect the speakers and because I think it gives it a nice look. I tried to convince my wife to record her reaction when she saw it, but I didn't succeed. Anyway, seeing her reaction, it's probably for the best that I didn't record it. When I showed it to her, the first thing she said was, "This is not what I asked for." After a few seconds of silence, she added, "This is 1,000 times better." I almost had a heart attack, but well, she loves it, so everyone's happy. Hope you guys liked it too. See you next time.